The French Revolution is remembered as a storm of politics, a furious eruption of anger, liberty, and bloodshed that tore a kingdom apart. But behind the speeches, behind the riots, behind the guillotine itself, there was a quieter, colder force tightening around France long before the first shot was fired. A force no politician could escape, no king could negotiate, and no idealist could ignore. Money, or rather, the absence of it. Because the fall of the French monarchy didn't begin with a cry for freedom. It began with a balance sheet drowning in red ink. And if you follow the money, really follow it, you discover a story far more disturbing than a clash of ideas. You discover a nation whose financial foundation rotted from within until the only thing holding it up was confidence. And when that confidence cracked, the entire country collapsed like a building with termites in the beams. It wasn't philosophy that destroyed the French state. It was insolvency. The monarchy tried to hide it under the velvet and gold, but the numbers told the truth. War after war had drained the treasury, from funding the American Revolution to competing with Britain for colonial dominance. Taxes fell heavily on the poor, while the nobility and clergy lived in a different universe altogether, shielded by exemptions that made the system feel less like taxation and more like a punishment for being ordinary. Yet France kept borrowing, and borrowing, and borrowing. Private lenders, the equivalent of Europe's financial elite, kept feeding the machine, charging interest rates that slowly bled the kingdom dry. The monarchy became a hostage of the very people financing it. Every year the state collected less than it owed. Every year the gap widened. Every year the ceiling sagged just a little more. By the late 1780s, France was no longer a kingdom. It was a corporation in default. And that's when the panic began, not among the poor, but among the financiers, the ones who saw the ledgers, the ones who understood that a monarchy can bluff its citizens, but it cannot bluff its creditors. Behind closed doors, the king's ministers debated desperate measures. Raise taxes? Impossible. The wealthy estates would block it. Cut spending? The court would revolt. Default on the debt? A financial suicide note. So France reached for the last tool available to a drowning government. Create money. Not gold, not silver, paper, the assignat. It was supposed to be brilliant, a currency backed not by metal, but by confiscated land. A workaround, a lifeline, a way to print stability out of thin air. And for a brief, shimmering moment, it worked. These strange new notes moved through the economy like a promise. But promises are fragile, especially when made by a government people no longer trust. The assignats multiplied. Their value shrank, prices exploded, and the public realized the terrifying truth. The state wasn't rescuing the economy, it was devouring it. Hyperinflation is not an event. It's a psychological break. Once people stop believing in money, they stop believing in order. Bread prices soared beyond reach. Merchants refused the paper notes. Crowds filled the streets, not with ideology, but with hunger. And policymakers, rattled by the chaos they created, turned the printing press faster. What began as a financial crisis mutated into a political furnace hot enough to melt the monarchy itself. The French Revolution wasn't born from liberty. It was born from bankruptcy. The guillotine didn't rise because people dreamed of democracy. It rose because the government was broke, the currency was collapsing, and the people were desperate. When money fails, the system fails. Every system. That is the hidden truth of the French Revolution. The truth no painting, no textbook, no patriotic retelling ever foregrounds. The blade didn't fall because of philosophy. It fell because of inflation. This is where the story starts, not with ideals, but with insolvency. Not with revolutionaries, but with accountants. Not with fire, but with debt. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. To understand how France reached the edge of collapse, you have to picture the country not as a nation, but as a household trapped in a spiral of expenses it can no longer afford. Every year, the monarchy spent far more than it earned. Every year, it covered the gap with loans. And every loan came with interest. Interest that quietly wrapped itself around the country like a tightening rope. The king still held ceremonies. The nobles still danced in gold-threaded halls. But behind the glitter, the treasury was decomposing. France's tax system was a masterpiece of inequality. The poor paid almost everything. The wealthy estates paid almost nothing, and the church contributed only what it wished. This wasn't just unfair, it was economically suicidal. You cannot fund a nation on the backs of people who have nothing. And yet, for generations, France had tried. As debts multiplied, lenders grew nervous. They watched the monarchy like a doctor watches a fading patient. They saw the missed payments, the accounting tricks, the promises that contradicted each other. And when lenders start to doubt, they stop lending. That was the real beginning of the revolution, not the riots, not the speeches, not the storming of the Bastille. The moment creditors lost confidence, the monarchy's fate was sealed. Because a government without money is not a government. It is a building with no foundation. France's ministers begged for reforms. They warned the king that the numbers no longer added up. They proposed taxing nobles. They proposed restructuring debt. They proposed austerity that would shake the aristocracy to its core. And each time, the privileged classes refused, clinging to their exemptions the way drowning men cling to breath. The state was collapsing in slow motion, and everyone in power thought someone else would pay the price. But the reality was harsher. No one was going to save France. Not the nobles, not the church, not the foreign bankers, not the royal court. A financial system built on inequality always ends the same way, violently, suddenly, without dignity. By 1788, the treasury was not just empty, it was negative. The government had no gold, no silver, no credit, no trust. It had burned every bridge with its lenders. Even its own tax collectors refused to advance funds. So the monarchy reached for the last weapon available to failed states, the printing press. The assignats were born not from innovation, but from desperation. Confiscated church land was used as collateral, but collateral only matters when people still believe the issuer has control. France was losing control by the hour. At first, merchants accepted the new notes. They wanted to believe. People always want to believe their country can recover. But belief is a currency with a brutally short expiration date. The government printed more assignats, then more, then far more than the value of all the land that backed them. And suddenly, the paper became just paper. Inflation turned daily life into chaos. Workers demanded higher wages. Shopkeepers refused to sell flour unless paid in metal. Farmers hoarded grain rather than accept currency that lost value between sunrise and sunset. Markets collapsed. Prices soared. Hunger spread. The monarchy blamed speculators. The assembly blamed hoarders. The crowds blamed everyone. But the truth was simple. France had printed its way into oblivion. Hyperinflation didn't create political radicalism, it amplified it. Moderates were swept aside because moderates cannot function in a collapsing economy. When bread costs triple by noon, people stop listening to reason. They listen to anger. They listen to certainty. They listen to anyone who promises order in a world turning liquid. And so the radicals rose, carried upward by a tide of economic fear the government itself had unleashed. By the time the revolution erupted in full force, France wasn't fighting for liberty. It was fighting for survival. The monarchy could still host a banquet, but it could no longer buy bread. That's the real story of the French Revolution. A nation that broke not because of ideals, but because the mathematics of its survival failed. Economics didn't cause the revolution. Economics cornered it. And once a nation's money collapses, everything built on that money follows. The collapse of France's finances didn't just destabilize the economy. It rewired the psychology of an entire nation. When money loses meaning, people begin to see their world through a different lens. Every transaction feels suspicious. Every price feels like an attack. Every rumor feels like truth. And in 1789, France was drifting into that dangerous emotional twilight where fear becomes fuel. Across the countryside, whispers spread faster than assignats could be printed. Villagers spoke of grain shortages orchestrated by nobles. Merchants accused officials of manipulating prices. Farmers refused to bring crops to market, terrified that the currency they received would be worthless by the end of the week. Panic filled the void where stability had once lived. France wasn't just broke, it was unraveling. And in Paris, the Assembly, desperate for control, attempted to engineer confidence the way a doctor might try to revive a failing patient with electric shocks. More laws, more decrees, more threats, price controls on everything from flour to candles, punishments for speculators, raids on hoarded grain, lists of enemies of the nation. But price controls don't fix inflation. They only hide it until the shelves go empty. Merchants close their shops rather than sell goods at a loss. Farmers slaughtered livestock because feeding them cost more than the animals were worth. Entire neighborhoods starved not because food didn't exist, but because no one trusted the paper money that supposedly represented value. This wasn't ideology. This wasn't political theory. This was the math of survival. People turned to gold and silver. They traded in secret markets. They relied on barter. They did everything humans do when the government's money becomes poison. And the revolutionaries, cornered by chaos they couldn't control, chose the oldest political solution to economic failure: find someone to blame. The nobles became targets. The clergy became targets. Bankers, merchants, hoarders, anyone with food or savings, all became suspects. Economic collapse sharpened the knives far more effectively than philosophy ever could. The streets of Paris, once filled with protests and pamphlets, began to fill with torches and accusations. And the revolution, which had started with speeches about equality and liberty, began to take on a darker pulse. A pulse driven by the fear that tomorrow's bread might not exist. When a nation is starving, it stops debating. It starts eliminating obstacles. That's when the revolution took its turn, not because the people wanted violence, but because the system had cornered them into believing violence was the only remaining currency left. Hyperinflation didn't just empty purses, it emptied patience. The radicals who rose to power were not lifted by ideology alone. They were lifted by hunger, by panic, by the collective realization that the old structures were incapable of restoring order. And in that environment, the most dangerous men are not the cruel, but the certain. Robespierre, Danton, Marat. Their voices carried because they offered clarity in a world where prices had no clarity, where money had no meaning, where the line between security and chaos was thinning daily. The assignat had done something no army could achieve. It dissolved trust between the government and its people. And once trust collapses, the system doesn't just break, it detonates. What came next was not the inevitable outcome of revolutionary passion. It was the logical outcome of financial collapse. A government that could no longer guarantee the value of money soon found itself unable to guarantee the value of life. The guillotine rose not as a symbol of ideology, but as the final tool in a nation trying to impose order when its economy could no longer provide it. The revolution didn't destabilize France. France's economy destabilized the revolution. And every political decision that followed, every purge, every decree, every execution, was shaped by the fear that if the system didn't find stability soon, the country itself would dissolve completely. France was no longer fighting the monarchy. It was fighting mathematics. By the early 1790s, France had crossed an invisible line, the point where a financial crisis mutates into something far more dangerous, a political creature with no brakes. What began as mismanaged budgets and reckless borrowing had become a runaway machine powered by fear, suspicion, and collapsing trust. And once a nation reaches that state, events don't unfold, they accelerate. The assignat was now a dead currency walking. People accepted it not because they trusted it, but because refusing it meant treason. Shops displayed prices that changed by the hour. Bread riots erupted over crumbs. Farmers fled markets because selling food meant exchanging real goods for paper that rotted in their hands. And in the vacuum of trust, every rumor felt like a prophecy. The revolution was still speaking the language of liberty, but the streets were now speaking the language of survival. In this fevered atmosphere, the radicals seized the moment. The Jacobins weren't lifted to power by ideology. They were lifted by a simple, terrifying promise. They could restore order. Not by fixing the economy. No one could fix it now, but by controlling the panic that the economy had unleashed. And their method was brutal. Economic crimes became political crimes. Profiteering was treated like treason. Speculators were accused of sabotaging the nation. Merchants were marched to tribunals for raising prices. Farmers were imprisoned for refusing to sell grain. But none of these people had caused the crisis. They were simply trying to survive it. The real culprit, the collapsed financial system, was too large to arrest. So the revolution hunted the faces attached to the symptoms. The guillotine became the economic regulator. Every failed policy made the radicals more paranoid. Every shortage made them more aggressive. Every printed assignat pushed France deeper into insanity. Hyperinflation turned politics into a war of everyone against everyone. And the men who once promised justice now promised purity. Purity meant sacrifice. Sacrifice meant blood. Robespierre, convinced that stability required eliminating all enemies of the revolution, unleashed the reign of terror, a political storm born directly from economic collapse. Over 16,000 executions, thousands more without trial, and a nation living under the shadow of a machine designed to solve a financial crisis with fear. It didn't work. It couldn't work. Because France wasn't killing traitors, it was killing symptoms. By 1794, the assignat had lost 99% of its value. Paper money that once symbolized salvation was now trash blowing in the streets. The treasury that once funded Europe's greatest kingdom was emptier than ever. Merchants refused all government notes. The countryside ignored Paris entirely, and the revolution, starving and broke, turned on itself. The blade that had risen to save France now circled back toward the hands that raised it. Robespierre fell, not because the nation rejected his ideas, but because the system had reached full saturation. The revolution had consumed every scapegoat available. Inflation devoured the currency, fear devoured the leadership. And for the first time in years, France stood face to face with the real enemy, its own failed financial architecture. The monarchy hadn't collapsed from ideology. The terror hadn't erupted from philosophy. The revolution hadn't turned violent because the people were cruel. It happened because the government lost control of money. And once money collapses, everything built on top of it, institutions, laws, trust, even morality, begins to rot. France had reached the breaking point where economics and politics become indistinguishable, and survival becomes the only ideology left. That was the true climax of the French Revolution, not the fall of the king, but the fall of the currency. When the dust finally settled, France emerged from the revolution not just without its monarchy, but without the illusions that had once held the country together. The crowds, the speeches, the terror, all of it traced back to one truth the nation could no longer escape. When money fails, society follows. The revolution didn't just change France. It rewired the world's understanding of how economies shape politics, and how trust is the most valuable currency a nation possesses. If you want more documentaries exposing the hidden forces behind money and power, subscribe. The next story is even deeper.